but I wanted to welcome all of you to the webinar on data centers and the energy landscape. My name is Catherine Reed, and I serve as Senior Program Director with the National Association of State Energy Officials, also known as NASEO. So for those of you who are not familiar with NASEO, we're a national nonprofit that supports all 56 state and territory energy offices throughout the United States. And we serve as a resource for and about state energy offices on a wide spectrum of energy topics. Next slide, please. And you can see the various program areas that we work in. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of energy topics. And we do this support through a variety of means. So one of the ways that we do this is through events such as this. We host national dialogues on emerging energy issues like this event today. Next slide, please. So I'm pleased to welcome you today to the first webinar in the NASEO discussion series on the topic of powering up data centers. This series will explore specific strategies that state and territory energy offices can use to address growing data center electricity demand while supporting energy affordability and grid reliability. The goal of this discussion series is to enhance the state's understanding of challenges and opportunities associated with data centers, and to ensure that states are better equipped to develop policies and programs to meet the energy needs in their state and propel economic development. I'm excited to say that the future webinars will delve into technological tools and innovations to optimize grid and data center interactions, explore the state-of-the-art energy efficient cooling options, learn about projected innovations in chip design that would lower power use per computation, and to learn how to ensure reliable and secure backup power is in existence, as well as explore the interaction with state energy security plans. So you can see this is the first of many conversations on this topic. And I do want to say we welcome your input into future topic ideas. As we know, this issue is ever evolving. And then finally, I want to recognize the U.S. Department of Energy's State Energy Program Office for supporting this work and for making this series possible. So thanks to them. So next slide. So before we start, just a few housekeeping reminders. This is a Zoom webinar format, so only speakers and panelists will have camera and mic access. But please note that following the presentations and moderating discussion, we'll have an opportunity for audience Q&A. And we really encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please do that. We are very much interested in hearing what you have to say, what questions you have. And if for some reason we don't get to that, we will follow up following this webinar to try to provide you with the answers to the questions you raise. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will ultimately be posted on the NASEO website. Just a quick overview of the agenda. Next slide, thank you. So first we'll hear from Vince Maiden, who serves as Managing Director of the State Energy Office of the Virginia Department of Energy. And he'll provide an opening remarks as well as share of the perspective from Virginia, one of the states on the front lines of data center growth. Next, we'll hear from Sarah Smith, who serves as research scientist in the Sustainable Energy Systems Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And she's going to present the findings from the 2024 U.S. Data Center Energy Usage Report that was released in December of last year. Following Sarah's presentation, we'll hear from Jesse Nofsinger, who serves as partner with McKinsey & Company. And he's going to provide an overview of some of the exciting opportunities and innovations that he is seeing in addressing data center challenges around the country. Our final speaker will be Brian George, who serves as U.S. Federal Lead for Global Energy Market Development and Policy at Google. Brian will share his perspective on how Google is planning for their data center needs. Following Brian's presentation, Vince will then lead a moderated discussion with all the panelists. And finally, there will be a time for audience Q&A, where we'd like to have the speakers answer any questions that you all as audience members have. And please be sure to use the Q&A function. And we'll make every effort to get those questions to the speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Vince Maiden. Thank you.
Thank you. As she noted, I'm Vince Maiden. I'm with the State Energy Office here in Virginia. Obviously, we've been really involved in a lot of data center discussions, because in Virginia, think it's pretty well known. We were kind of the epicenter for the data center growth, but I think everybody's starting to realize it is spreading to other states, other parts of Virginia. And this is an issue that we're going to have to address if we're going to meet the moment on data center growth and opportunities that come with that. And I think the United States always wants to be the leader, and I think we're going to continue to be the leader in AI development and data centers. So we all should buckle up and figure out how to solve this. I'm really happy that I'm on a panel with a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me to help figure this out. And I'm not going to take up too much time, but I do want to go through a few slides that our team modeling lead here, Assis Sadeh, had put together just to kind of show you the landscape in Virginia, which is quickly becoming the landscape in other places. So I'll go through a few slides and then I'll hand it over to the speakers. So next slide. So in Virginia, as noted, we've become the global capital of data centers. And I thought one of the interesting facts was that in Northern Virginia, the market is of all the 5 other states, top leading states, the Northern Virginia only data center market is larger. And then also the next 4 world markets, the Northern Virginia only data center market is larger than those. So that kind of puts into context what we have seen here in Virginia. This has really hit the Dominion zone, and we'll talk a little bit about demand growth in the Dominion zone here in Virginia. Next slide. And what's that's led to is in Virginia, 1/4 of our total electricity in 2023 was consumed by data centers. And by 2030, if we look at 5%, 10% growth models, and 15%, that could go as high as 46%, or nearly half of all the electricity in Virginia could be consumed by data centers in a large growth model. So that's pretty staggering, but you can see other states are starting to see a climb as well. And you can see that in other states as well in these growth models. Next slide. So as mentioned, we have a cluster in Northern Virginia, which really led the charge. But what we're starting to see is it moved down 95 into the Richmond area. There's new data centers announced all the time in the Richmond area. We obviously have some in the Virginia Beach area. Southside Virginia has seen growth in data centers. And most recently, there's been more and more interest in Southwest Virginia to deploy data centers. So I think similar spread into rural counties could happen in other states. And I think there's just going to be a natural growth outside of the Northern Virginia corridor moving forward. Next slide. So in 2029, we saw 26 new data centers come on board in the Dominion zone in Virginia. And so that represented a clear spike in the increase in capacity and demand that was really driven by numbers. The numbers have leveled out, and what we're seeing now, even with similar numbers each year, the AI-driven growth for demand is occurring. So we're seeing more demand, but the same number of facilities coming on board in Virginia. So that's driving our more recent growth. Next slide. And for the naysayers who thought, oh, maybe this demand's going to cool off, it's not really coming. Dominion came out in their earnings call for the last quarter. They had approximately 19 gigawatts of increased total contracted capacity from July 2024 to December 24. 19 gigawatts of contracted capacity in less than 6 months is pretty staggering. So we are continuing to see strong growth trajectory in Virginia. Next slide. So in Virginia, our mix and our makeup is 55% natural gas, 32% nuclear. Solar is growing in Virginia. We're starting, we've got good growth in solar. We still do have some coal, a little bit of wind, and some other sources. But what Virginia has had to do is I'm not sure that I'm super proud of it, but we've had to import and depend on our PJM other states and import more and more of our electricity. 36% of the supply is the highest of any state. And while our nearby Pennsylvania, thank you, Pennsylvania, is exporting 26% of its generation to be consumed in other places. So I think Virginia does need to continue to add resources. That's why we, really adopted an all of the above energy strategy, which includes advanced nuclear, solar, wind, battery, natural gas, all the different opportunities to try to meet this challenge that's coming. Next slide. So our legislature they recognized that we really needed to look at this. They commissioned a study done by a group we call JLARC, the JLARC study. Many of you might have seen that. If not, you should take a look at it. But they looked at unconstrained growth, a PJM forecast adjusted growth, and unconstrained growth in the Dominion zone. Average monthly energy use was 183% growth. If you look at the data center growth in Virginia, by 2024, PJM adjusted was 152% by 2040. So in any scenario, unless you throttle down development and constrain it or limit it, we're seeing really significant growth in Virginia. Our current governor is not supportive of constraining growth and wants to push economic growth. So we're looking at more unconstrained growth in Virginia. Next slide. Dominion peak demand forecast. Here's a projection of out more than double we're looking at in the Dominion territory by 2035. That's pretty frightening to think about, but it also represents a lot of opportunities and growth opportunities as we move forward. Next slide. So I'll caveat all that either exciting or terrifying news, depending on how you want to look at it, with there are some caveats. We're seeing potential, and we're already seeing more efficient AI chips, potential cooling improvements, opportunities for co-located data centers. And then there's also going to be some policy pushback depending on what state you're in and what the, each General Assembly here in Virginia. I think we're going to be talking about data centers and have numerous bills every year. So there's potential for that to change it. But I think this panel will cover a lot of different things in this aspect and answer a lot of the questions. But I really just wanted to give everybody an overview of what we're looking at in Virginia, what you may be starting to look at in your states, what you may soon be looking at in your states. With that, I'm going to hand it to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Vince, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I'm part of the team that does the U.S. data center energy use reports. So if we'll go to the next slide, I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of history lesson here, just because I think it's really helpful to understand these different eras that we've seen in terms of data center energy use and help give that mindset in terms of, what era are we in now and where might we be, going in the future. So Berkeley Lab's first big report on this topic came out in 2007. And there was a lot of concern over the rapid growth of energy use at data centers. We found about a doubling in energy use between 2000 and 2005. And in our modeled scenarios and our forecasts, we thought, okay, maybe this will continue on this trajectory, or maybe there are opportunities for efficiency that would bring that energy use down. And at this time, data centers were largely internal at the company of ownership's facilities. The cooling systems were using a lot of energy. The servers were not being utilized very heavily, and it was contributing to a lot of electricity use. And then in the next slide, we have our results from our second report, which came out in 2016. And we actually found that a lot of these efficiency opportunities were being realized with the shift to the cloud. So larger data centers that could better kind of condense computing onto fewer machines using virtualization and things to run servers at higher utilization levels, as well as really big improvements in cooling system efficiency. And so we found that the energy use had pretty much flattened between 2008 or so out to 2014. So again, we thought, okay, maybe this trend will continue, or maybe there's, a little bit more efficiency we could eke out of the system and actually have a reduction in energy use. And then next slide will show our most recent results that came out in our December report. As we all know, the energy use has not continued to be flat since our last report came out. We sort of turned our backs, and then AI happened and everything took off. So we've, definitely in another growth era. We're finding that, energy use is on a high trajectory of growth with accelerators going out into data centers. We really had realized a lot of efficiency potential during the last decade with that shift to the cloud. And so as the computing demands have gone up with the AI era, the electricity use has essentially followed. The next slide is the sort of, so yeah, that was a bit of just background on what we had seen, since 2000 in this space. And then this slide is our sort of top line result figure from that December report that shows from 2014 up until 2023, that solid black line here was the orange line on the previous slide. And we found that data center energy use had grown from our first report, it was about 1%. Our second report, it was about 2% of the nation's electricity use. And now we're estimating, it's approaching 5%, with the potential to grow just in the next few years to be 7 to 12% of US electricity demand. So here we have our, kind of attempt at doing a forecast. As you can see from some of the last reports, it's a really hard thing to forecast. We can only go off of, the information we have today. But we see this rapid growth continuing definitely in the next few years, but with a decent amount of uncertainty here. And a couple things I want to kind of pause and point out with these numbers and these results. So the scope of our modeling effort is all US data centers. So this is everything from, a server closet that might be at a convenience store or a fast food location or in an office building, all the way up to a hyperscale, really large scale AI or other data center. This does not include cryptocurrency. We do address that type of computing demand in our report, but as a sort of separate breakout section. So that's sort of the scope here is like traditional data centers of all sizes. And the units here are very different than kind of what Vince is talking about and what a lot of people talk about, which is data center capacity. So in our reporting, we try to estimate the actual consumption, the power draw into these facilities to understand, the kind of true needs and again, the efficiency opportunities and things like that. How these numbers translate to capacity numbers is a bit hard to pin down because it depends, when someone is reporting a capacity number, are they talking about the facilities, like nameplate, the capacity of the power infrastructure? Are they talking about the peak demand or, what that metric is? So we have some, comments on that in our report as well, but just want to note that. So the overall trends in demand will be the same, roughly the same across all these metrics, but the values might be a little hard to compare against what you might see in news reporting and things like that. So, okay, I think I'll just spend a couple more minutes diving into why is this, what goes into this big gray wedge. And to give you a little context of how we come up with these numbers, I won't walk through all the details of this, but this is the sort of flow chart of how we do our modeling. So it's a bottom-up model that starts with data on shipments of IT equipment. So we work with industry data collection partners who tell us, how many servers, how many accelerators, what different markets those servers are going into in terms of the types and the sizes of facilities. We also get data on storage and networking devices. And then we build up estimates for all those different devices installed in all those different locations, how do they actually consume power? So we have models for server wattages that consider how hard those servers are being run, again, how many accelerators are on them. All different generations of accelerators of GPUs, of course, are having very different power requirements. So that all gets built into the model. And that gets us to our estimate of the IT equipment's electricity consumption, which then gets layered on with, okay, where are these facilities? What types of cooling systems do they have? How much energy is needed to cool them? And, what's the water demands and things like that. And then we kind of carry forward to get total electricity and carbon and water footprint estimates for these numbers. And so because of that, we have a lot of different we can have a lot of breakouts in the report of, how much energy is going to these different server types, how much energy is going to these different types of locations, and give that underlying detail, as well as assess, scenarios at a more kind of targeted approach. So the next slide will show, we'll start going through just a few of the big unknowns at the time of our modeling, and again, kind of what's driving that wedge in our forecast results. So the big one is the growth of AI, the accelerators, the GPU shipments. You can see here we have, definitely very rapid growth going out between 2024 and 2028, but a lot of uncertainty as well. And the way we kind of set these bounds for our report was the high scenario was we got updated shipment numbers in like late November, shipment estimates for our December report. So we really wanted to get, the up to the minute best data we could. And there was a lot of expectations around, looking at what NVIDIA and these chip companies are producing and how they've been performing relative to their forecasts in the past, and kind of assuming that aggressive outperformance continued into the future. So we sort of set that as our higher scenario, and our lower scenario was using the same data set, but from about a year prior. So it just also goes to show how quickly these things are changing. So if we had just used that data from a year prior, that low scenario would have been our sort of baseline estimate. But there was so much growth and so much activity that there's a big change there. And when you're looking at these nearer term forecasts, you can look at earnings reports and orders that have been placed, things that are getting built, but even then, orders can be canceled, things can change. Again, it's all very uncertain. And then another area of uncertainty on the next slide is not only how many of these servers and these accelerators are installed, but once they're installed, how are they run? How are they actually consuming power? So you can look up the nameplate power capacity of a given machine, but that's not going to be, what's actually being consumed on a second to second basis. So we collect data on what are the servers using in their typical operational state, when they're doing a training run or doing a inference, what are they using when they're idling? And then thinking about, okay, now how much across a whole year, how hot, quote unquote, hard are they being run? How much are they idling? What does that utilization curve look like? And that still leaves us with a good amount of uncertainty here. So the bands you see here are our sort of the historical numbers. It's not that we know those numbers, it's just we kind of have to make a best guess and draw a line in the sand for the historical data. But then moving forward, we try to capture some of this uncertainty in our scenarios as well. And we have a lot of ongoing work collecting more data from lab facilities and supercomputers, and trying to set up more test beds and things like that to better understand what energy use we should expect as future generations of these machines get installed. And then the last uncertainty I'll point out is around on the next slide, just where exactly these facilities are and where they're getting built. As we've been, even just over the last few months since the report has come out, we have been, putting a lot more effort into better understanding what data is out there. There's a lot of research being done at consulting firms and different market research firms to really list out every single data center, what's been built, what's the timeline for, if it's a phased development, how much is going to be built out each year. anything that's been announced. We are getting a better sense of this, but it was something we incorporate into our modeling, again, to try to capture the variations in cooling systems and things, but we're always interested in more data on this, both for, just what's on the ground, what's built, what are they using, and also where's that electricity coming from? Because if we want to do realistic carbon footprinting analysis, or just understanding water usage and things, it helps to know exactly who is serving that electricity, whether it's the general grid mix or it's PPAs or things like that. And some companies are very transparent on that, but it's hard to kind of get really comprehensive data for the industry as a whole to get that right. I think I just have one more slide. Yes. So these are some of the kind of takeaways and things that we're thinking about in our ongoing work. I mentioned a bit about the forecasts. We only go out a few years. Even then, there's still a decent amount of range. And anything beyond that, there's so many external factors. We've seen these different eras of growth that yes, can be tied to computational demands or efficiency measures, but also can be potentially tied to economic conditions. Is there a recession going on? Is there, whatever else might be influencing the investments being made? And so definitely a lot of uncertainty in the future, and especially anything more granular than a nationwide estimate. Where these facilities are going to get built is very uncertain. It just is, up to so many different factors. So I always say, I really feel for utility planners and state planners who are trying to have an answer for this, because especially now that the facilities are getting so large and concentrated, if it goes in your territory versus your neighbor's territory, could be a game changer. So yeah, very challenging. We recognize that. And then I guess, I'll just speak to this next point quickly. In our latest scenario, we didn't do quote unquote efficiency scenarios like we had done in our prior two reports. And largely that was because of this idea of like Javron's paradox. People are talking about with AI that there's so much demand for these services and to be able to develop these models and make things better, that if you make things more efficient, what we would expect to happen is that companies would then run more models, run bigger models, do more with whatever power capacity they have, or whatever the bottleneck is, whether it's power or capital investment, or something that, any efficiency that we might see in the near term would likely be kind of rebounded by just doing more. So I think, we'll have to see kind of how things develop on the investment side and on the technology development side to see if we do potentially enter another era of those efficiency gains that can offset some of the growing electricity needs. But we didn't really see that being a major factor in the near term forecasts. I think that's my time, and I know we'll have more time to talk about some of these other things.
Excellent. I'll step in now. Thanks, Sarah and Vince. And I will try to build on the great work and presentations leading into also Brian's presentation rather than repeat. But I will say everything I've heard resonates, and I'll skip quickly through some of the details that are repetitive. So if we go to the first slide here. I want to call out there's a big growth of data centers that we're seeing at the state level that, Sarah's talked about when we look at hundreds of terawatt hours of demand. And I just want to highlight 6 drivers that I think are shaping the industry sort of right below the surface. One is this idea that it's hyperscaler. So there's a bit of a concentration of the players who are buying and installing the GPUs. And that what we've seen with Gen AI and other high performance compute applications are driving the disruption. We're also seeing that power and energy are becoming the bottleneck, or it's becoming the constraint. And so as where it used to be chips, now we're looking at power grids and energy infrastructure, which is, partly why I think this is such an interesting and important topic for you all. And then there's a couple of places around the behavior of these companies, and I won't purport to assume that they're all the same, or that what the sort of internal discussions haven't shifted over time. But we're seeing the value of the power is very high to a data center, particularly one that's selling cloud services that can be monetized. And so there is a question here, in terms of the margins of the data center don't depend as heavily on the cost of power as, say, an aluminum smelter or another energy intense industry. And so there is a difference in how a buyer of power for a data center, particularly at a hyperscaler, might think about the cost of it. We're also seeing that the activity across the market has been pretty dramatic. Lots of announcements of partnerships and JVs, and creative ways either to come to market or to build new equipment. We've seen new cooling technologies and new sort of underlying infrastructure plays that are sort of driving innovation in the space. And then below that, there is a huge sustainability commitment from most of the major players with a short timeline and aggressive goals, which is shaping a bit around the power buying. I'll probably lean on Brian a bit and step back and let him sort of explain that. But then the piece that comes in a lot when we talk about state energy offices, utility planning commissions, the pressure that is coming now on the utilities to deliver this power. And some of the instances we've seen of either data centers locating to other jurisdictions where there's not power available, or doing things like building off grid. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to highlight one point on the growth. And to Sarah's point, we're using gigawatts in here. We talk about it as IT nameplate, which is a bit different than the total rated connection that you would see as a utility, and is a 2 or 3 steps removed from what the energy consumption is. But the point that I want to call out is there's a big concentration. So we talk about 70% of the capacity being used, bought, consumed by 2030 is concentrated among the, call it 4 to 6 hyperscalers, depending on your definition. Whereas there's a fair number of the long tail of colo providers who are buying capacity, and a fair amount of that is leased to these hyperscalers. It's also leased to enterprises. But this idea that the growth rate is going to be 15 to 20% a year, and that it's among a concentrated set of companies, really is an important piece of this dynamic when you think about as a state or a utility, how to position yourself and understand the context of the situation. So we go to the next slide. We look at utility trends a lot. I do a lot of my work across the whole energy industry. And the narrative has started to be a bit of the sky is falling if you're in the energy side. Load is growing dramatically, and I won't try to read this all to you. This is kind of a standard slide we use to frame the industry and the power sector in the US now. But load's growing, and by the way, it's a bit uncertain, but it's big, is the first thing we hear. The second one is building generation is challenging for various reasons, whether it's PUC justification or the market constructs and the dynamic of how some of the competitive markets are set up, making investment cases difficult. We also see that the mix is dramatically evolving from one that's largely thermal based, where the merit curve actually creates an investment signal, and you can be pretty clear on what the generation output is, capacity available by generator, to one where we have a lot more renewables that tend to, when it's sunny, you've got power, or it's windy, there's power coming in. And so managing that intermittency, while completely within the capabilities of grid planners and operators, changes the dynamic a bit. And then on top of that, we need to build the grid. Lots more load and lots more generation means more grid is needed. And if you look at the total line miles that we're adding, especially of high voltage transmission per year, it pales in comparison to what was built through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then we start to talk about some of the other major factors, one being climate hazards and weather events. We've had quite a few hurricanes in the last few years that have brought down power for a lot of people over multiple days. We see winter storms coming in. We've also seen heat waves that have really stressed the grid in various jurisdictions. And then finally, the piece that ties it all together is that we have regulators and utilities who, in some instances, feel as if they're sort of coming off of a back foot, trying to manage a sector that's kind of gotten out of control very quickly. At the same time that you have inflation across the economy, power bills are going up, and there's real strain on the general sort of rate paying public, trying to sort of be a part of this system where traditionally we've had really low cost energy, particularly electricity, if you compare the US writ large to other developed countries. So that's the narrative we often hear or start with. But I'd actually like to pivot to the next slide and call out that in reality, we don't think the sky is falling, and there's actually a ton of opportunity that comes with innovation. Sarah, I think, mentioned Javon's paradox and this idea that if we make compute cheaper, maybe it takes off more. I think we like to look at the sort of the silver lining of this industry that, to a lot of folks in the energy sector, it's come out of nowhere and caught everyone by surprise over the last 18 months. And I'll go into a little detail behind these, but I just do the voiceover and say that load is growing, but it's already actually started to come online. We're pretty confident in it. You saw the numbers from Sarah driven directly by data centers, but we can see them in the bulk system. I'll show you in a moment. We also have seen that the deployments of solar and storage are, setting records year over year, and the same was true in 2024. And when we look at announced capacity for new gas units, which on average, the generating efficiency of those units is much, much higher than if we look at, say, carbon emissions per ton or per megawatt hour of the rest of the thermal fleet, it looks very promising. And we're also hearing lots of innovation around how do we address these interconnection queues that seem to be jamming up or bottlenecking the system, and what are the innovations that actually can come from the players who really want power quickly to help speed up the system's responsiveness. At 3, there's, instead of saying the mix is evolving and we're going to have to figure out a way to manage it, we actually are seeing investment in technologies that we talked a few years ago, things like next generation nuclear, which were always promising, but there were real questions about how could you get over the investment hurdle required to bring it to commercialization. Interest in long duration storage, enhanced geothermal, and even things like fusion reactors as potential new generating technologies. A lot of this real world commercial activity is coming from the fact that you've got large players with deep pockets who are interested in improving the power grid. I'd sort of run down the rest here and say that on transmission and distribution, there's all sorts of opportunity from grid enhancing technologies, thinking about dynamic line ratings, reconductoring the same corridor with much, much higher capacity wires, and using, again, the investment that is on the back of these relatively large balance sheet companies who are interested in improving the grid, really as grid citizens for everyone, to accelerate this. Finally, we've looked at, and I'll call out a few examples of where this compute is actually helping the sector, and things like improved O&M capabilities for how do you actually maintain the grid that you have better. And then finally, and again, calling back to some of the things Sarah mentioned she works on, this idea that now we're going to have potential integration of the demand into the load. And so instead of thinking of demand as this fixed thing that just hits the system and the supply side needs to meet it where it's there, you can actually start to create a market where you've got tariffs and flexibility on the demand side. And it doesn't have to be with data centers. It can be across the whole economy. And you think about things like differentiated products. If you're willing to have lower reliability of your power, say you work during the week and you're not home, from, call it, working hours. If you say I'm willing to give up some of my power reliability during those hours, you may see a dramatically lower bill and the system becomes more reliable for less CapEx. And so there is some innovation also on the policymaking, rate-making tariffs that can get to be pretty exciting as well. So just calling out a few things. One on the next slide. We talk about load growth that's coming. Took me 7 different ways to get to a version that I was kind of okay with. I'm still going to try to figure out the visual here, to be honest. But we've seen no load growth over the last 15 years in the US in aggregate. We call it 0.1% a year. If you pick, and your per annual numbers, it matters a lot when you pick the end years. 2007 just happened to be a high year back in the day, and so we can use that as a base off of. But no load growth didn't mean there was no load growth anywhere. It meant on average, we didn't see load growth across the US. And so there were states where there actually was substantial growth. The big ball near 1.72% is Texas. And you see states where load has declined, partly because population has stagnated a bit, but partly because there have been extreme energy efficiency programs that have been put into place. Look ahead now to the last 3 years. By the way, I skipped the dip over COVID because I think we didn't want to count the COVID bounce back as real load growth. But if you start in 2021, we're actually seeing close to 1.5% load growth per year nationally. And it's basically pulled up all states, but in particular ones where there has been a sort of data center boom. Texas, Arizona, Virginia are the ones I've called out here. Load growth has actually been substantial, and it's been faster than historical. And so I'd call out one that this is actually happening. It's not, this thing that will come in 5 to 10 years. And we've been, particularly at McKinsey, probably overly optimistic about EV penetration over the last 10 years. I think we're actually seeing the data center start to hit at the same time that some of the building efficiencies are kind of reaching the end of their sort of low-hanging fruit. So one, load growth is happening, and so we can get a little bit excited about planning around that. I think if you go to the next slide, this is a historical chart showing what we've built in the US. This is operating units and historically what year they were built, mixed between renewables, thermal, and storage. As you can see, we've seen a huge ramp up in the build of renewables. Storage has picked up dramatically in the last couple of years. And some of the thermal builds have fallen off a bit over the last, we'll call it 5 to 10 years. My call out here is there's a renewed interest in the investment in gas CCGTs, adding CCS to facilities, building new nuclear reactors, building new geothermal reactors or geothermal sites. And at the same time, we're going to continue to see kind of the buildup from renewables. The supply chains for solar have continued to remain robust. And so I actually see this picture, and rather than thinking of it as we can't build what we need, I'm looking at the last, decade from 2005 to 2015, where we were averaging more than double what we've run the last 15 years or 5 years, and saying the ability of the US economy and EPCs and the internet connection queue to figure out how to add that generation sits there. And so instead of looking at this as we're trapped and we can't build what we need, I'm actually looking at we've got the capacity. We've demonstrated in the past that we could build pretty dramatically when the signals were there, and to ramp this up to meet the demand using, again, the kind of momentum from the data center expansion is a great way to attack the potential problem that we always thought was going to come. We expected load to grow by 2030, maybe not this dramatically, but without a big focus from, say, some of these big players who have the ability to help spur the economy, it may have been harder and slower, but now we can sort of accelerate. And then one more slide, I'd really like to just call out the use cases where, we talk a lot about the data center boom happening to the power sector. I think there are things that can be extracted the other way. Some of this stuff we do, but, thinking broadly beyond kind of the work that I'm specifically involved in, we look at things like vegetation management using satellite imagery data and machine learning algorithms to, identify essentially what are the trees that grow the fastest and are going to cause the biggest problems during storms to basically improve outcomes for customers at lower costs because you can deploy your crews better. Or thinking things like storm events where really good weather and climate models can tell you days ahead, basically what's the severity you need to manage to. You can stage crews. You can plan ahead for what is the equipment you need, and then you can respond in the most efficient way to minimize customer downtime. And you can imagine that as you get more and more sophisticated models, both on sort of AI and machine learning, your ability to do that in real time gets better and better very quickly. And then we've also looked at things like using some advanced analytics techniques to improve the build time for things like thermal power plants. This is a CCGT example, but in this case, instead of having sort of a manual planner who's used to doing this over years and years, you let the computer sort of sift through what are the approaches that you might take that bring down both the cost and schedule. And then on top of this, we basically layer in this idea that, if you are someone who deals in the regulatory space, the amount of filings that exist across the country for utilities and PUCs is basically undigestible. And so it's hard if you're in the Southwest to really understand what's going on in the Northeast, given the number of sort of documents and dockets you need to read. We've had some success in seeing models where you can basically treat this as a ChatGPT or similar model to figure out what's going on in the regulatory landscape and then sort of port best practices around. So I'll wrap there because I think that's my 15 minutes, but I would say this is potentially a very exciting development, even though it feels like things are changing quickly. We shouldn't get too nervous about this amount of interest and excitement and really kind of, I don't want to say benevolent necessarily, but very positive dollars flowing into the space. They could potentially improve outcomes across customer classes.
Great. Well, happy to jump in and follow the excellent presentations so far. As was noted on the top of the call, my name is Brian George. I'm on the Google energy team and lead our work across the U.S. organized power markets. Also focus a lot of my time in Virginia. So I want to give a big thank you to Vince and the Virginia Department of Energy team and the governor and really everyone involved in the space in Virginia. It really is the epicenter of where we are experiencing this growth. And as Vince told you, it's not new, right? Virginia has hosted data centers for a long time, and we're going to continue to grow there. And so we're going to continue to grow everywhere else too. So with that, I will jump right in. And I was asked to talk a little bit about the planning. So I'm going to focus some comments high level, but then walk into some areas that we see as areas for opportunity. And I'm actually going to start where Jesse left off, because I think it is really important to contextualize a little bit. We often hear AI and machine learning, and sometimes they just become words, right? And a little disconnected from what it is we're actually doing. But it's important to keep in mind that we are really utilizing this technology to solve really challenging problems. And late last year, 2 Googlers were actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for work around utilizing AI to analyze DNA chains. And it's stuff that's way above my head, but I know at the end of the day, we're working towards solving really, really hard problems in medicine and beyond to hope to improve the quality of everyone's lives. And so I think it is important to make the intangible tangible, right? We are doing things with this data. We are processing information. We are largely doing building our data centers in response to our users, right? Yes, we talk about AI, we talk about machine learning, but we also have products that like search and cloud and YouTube. We also have cloud customers that run their businesses on our services. And so at the end of the day, when our customers signal a demand, whether it's internal or external, we have to make sure the energy exists to deliver on that. And so if we were in the audience, I would do a little exercise where I asked everyone to raise their hands. Unfortunately, I can't. But the point is, every time you Google something, check your email, look at a map, you name it, you are relying on physical infrastructure to process that information. And so as our industry grows, so it's incredibly critical that we have that access to infrastructure. And so I think for where we are now, it's probably fair to say that historically, our industry has really benefited from slack in the system, right? There's been a lot of excess transmission capacity, a lot of excess generation capacity that, over the past several years has been built out to serve various needs. And so as our industry has grown, we've really eliminated a lot of that slack. That's been good. It's been good because we're getting more use out of the existing system. But what it means is that now, as we're in this environment where we're planning for new infrastructure, we have to think about the costs and risks associated with that infrastructure in a slightly different way. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. But from our perspective, right, we're still planning on 24/7 base load energy demand, right? We're consuming energy around the clock. We benefit tremendously from the reliability of the grid, and thus we have a strong interest in seeing that grid continue to be built out in a robust and reliable manner. We also continue to have very aggressive sustainability goals. Google has committed to 24/7 carbon-free energy, which means that by 2030, we aim to operate all of our data centers and facilities with 100% carbon-free energy. That is an ambitious goal, and it's requiring us to think about investments in resources that we haven't done before. But as Jesse noted, it's making us invest in things like enhanced geothermal, like advanced nuclear, and these other clean, firm technologies, which is exciting, but also new. And so as we move forward, I think access to those types of resources is going to continue to be really important. And then the final kind of top level point I would make is that energy has become so critical our investment or to our overall planning, that it really is dictating, where we want to go. Access to energy and energy infrastructure really is key to thinking about how and where we can grow quickly. And so it's forcing us as a business to pay a lot more attention to energy and the energy regulatory environment. And so with that, we've really, I think it would be helpful to maybe articulate some of the key barriers, that we see, and not just barriers, but realities, right? We are facing dramatic growth that has been unseen in recent memory. But as Jesse pointed out, the sky is not falling. We have, as a country, been able to integrate low growth in the history and in our history, and I'm confident that we will be able to do that again. To do that, we obviously have to have generation capacity and transmission capacity. And so things like the interconnection queue are a real challenge to that growth. In our view, a lot of the interconnection queue delays could be resolved by the addition of transmission. And we need a significant amount of new transmission in this country to interconnect new resources. But fundamentally, we have to speed up the time it takes to build new infrastructure, or else we won't be able to connect new loads to the grid. And by the way, I should just say, we are talking a lot about data centers, but the load growth that we are seeing in this country right now is from more than just data centers. It's from the reshoring of domestic manufacturing. It's from electrification. It's from things that all benefit the American economy. And so we really need that fundamental updated grid to enable that broad set of load growth. And so, yes, data centers are a key part of that. But what we're talking about here really expands beyond data centers. The next challenge, the next area we're going to have to do a lot of thinking on is on cost allocation and risk management, right? As we're growing, the infrastructure that we're adding has a cost. And so we need to really think about what is the right way to equitably allocate those costs among different ratepayers. And what is the right risk allocation method to make sure that we as customers are bearing some of that investment risk in a way that we haven't done before. And so I go back late last year in Virginia. There was a report that was authored by a legislative committee known as JLARC that really dug deep into some of these questions around cost allocation and growth. I would recommend for folks interested to take a look at that. Subsequent to the release of that report, the Virginia Commission held a technical conference on data center growth and cost allocation, where there was a very robust discussion about how we maintain equitable treatment, but also ensure that data centers like ours are paying our fair share. And we have said consistently, right, that we are happy to pay our fair share. We will pay our fair share, but we have to know what that is. The final big challenge and risk that I would highlight, and one of the previous presenters mentioned this, but is uncertainty. There is a ton of uncertainty right now, whether it's a macro level or more specific to this industry. I think it's critical that as we move forward, we try to inject certainty everywhere we can. And one area that we think we can inject some of that certainty is around the planning function for this infrastructure. And in particular, we hear a lot about speculative or duplicative loads that are coming on to the grid. We think, in fact, that new loads like ours that are coming to the grid should be required to put more financial skin in the game, both over the term of a contract with a supplier, but at the outset through things like collateral. And late last year, there was a settlement that was achieved in Indiana with the utility there that we were proud to be a party to, that basically was the first settlement in the country that reflected this new paradigm, whereby we were kind of raising our hands, putting more skin in the game, and allowing the utilities to have more certainty that the infrastructure that they were building was going to, in fact, show up. If we can provide more certainty in the outset of the loads that are connecting to the grid, we can provide more certainty into things like the load forecast that informs transmission planning, and where we have it, capacity planning, right? And so we do think it all starts with that foundational level of certainty. We're never going to be able to get the load forecast 100% right. That is just how it is, but we can strive to make the load forecast as right as we can. And so we think there's a pretty big opportunity to replicate what was done in Indiana and other states around the country. The other issue, just to touch on briefly, we see as an opportunity is co-location. I believe Vince mentioned it at the outset. What's important for us is that we view co-location as something that should be done in close partnership with the grid, with planners, with RTOs. We think there is an opportunity to co-develop new generation resources alongside new loads. that take advantage of existing transmission interconnection points such that you are minimizing the need for network additions. To be very clear, we have no interest in taking existing assets from the grid and directly connecting them to our new assets. Co-location for us is about adding new generation alongside new load. That is fundamental in addition to our carbon-free energy objective. That's something we call our additionality component, which requires us to bring new megawatts of new generation to match our load. And so I'm excited about the co-location, co-development space. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but of course, we have to do it right. The final, or well, one of the two more areas that I'd like to touch on. The first is the investment in clean, firm technology. I'd mentioned it a little bit at the top, but just given the needs that we see of that round-the-clock firm baseload power, we are going to have to invest in things like advanced nuclear, enhanced geothermal. We're excited about our partnership with Fervo Energy in Nevada to bring on that enhanced geothermal asset, hopefully in a way that can scale that industry across the West. And then late last year, we did make an announcement with Kairos Energy to bring on 500 megawatts of advanced nuclear through the middle of the next decade. And so all of these things show how we are trying to put our capital and our dollars towards the development of resources that we know the grid needs moving forward. And then the final point that I would make, and this is more of a call to action, I think, I think we are all in this together. We're only going to build the grid out if we are partnering with all folks across the various sectors to make sure we're planning in the right way. I think that also in necessarily involves transparency. We have been, we always will be very transparent with our utility partners about what our needs are on the system, and doing so in a way that can really inform things like the load forecasts and other market tools. But then, of course, collaboration, right? We just have to continue to work together to make sure we are responding to the needs of the grid and making sure that we do remain that good grid citizen. So with that, we covered a lot of ground. I'm certainly happy to take any questions and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Brian, while you're warmed up and we've gotten through our speaking parts, I'll probably throw a question to you. So just for the folks on the call, I'm going to take a little moderator privilege and ask a few questions to get things flowing. And then there's already some questions in the chat, in the Q&A that we will address after we do a little bit of a guided, moderated discussion here. So if I'm a community leader somewhere, and I've heard that Loudoun County had the data center rainbow land in their county, and they found a pot of gold. Trying to get in the spirit here, and I'd like that rainbow to come to my locality. What are some of the siting, primary siting considerations for data center? What are the things that communities could do to make themselves more appealing to data center developments? Where do we need to start if you're wanting to get ready and you think you want that pot of gold to come to your county?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good question. I think at the end of the day, where we are now, one of the most critical things is power infrastructure availability, right? If we're going to build a new facility, right, we have to have line of sight into that ability of that facility to connect to the grid. And so even if you don't have a site that has infrastructure on it, right, we need to be able to see that we can get that infrastructure built in a timely manner. And I actually think that comes into the community engagement piece. A lot of the obstacles that we see to infrastructure development are at the local level. And so I think there's a lot of work that we could be doing as big loads, but also in partnership with our utilities to work with counties states and to the extent feds are required to really make sure we are building out infrastructure in a responsible manner, right? I think all too often folks see new transmission lines go up and think, well, what's the benefit of that line to my community? So I think we need to do a better job of explaining what those benefits are and how our investment in that community can be good from an economic perspective. And that actually, if I could maybe zoom out a second, that kind of goes back to the point that I was making about upfront investment risk, right? If we're going to be building out infrastructure to meet this, we have to be willing to take on more of that infrastructure investment risk, right? We can't be pushing that on to ratepayers. And so I think if we can show up and say, look, we are, raising our hand, taking on some of this risk, that helps alleviate some of the concerns. The other thing that I would flag out there is there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in things like grid enhancing technologies to take advantage of the existing system. I think if we can go to our community partners and say, in addition to this infrastructure or in addition to this facility that we are building, we are investing X dollars in things like advanced reconductoring or other GETs that reduce the need for overall additional infrastructure investment on the system. I think those are all opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, I think you led me really well into the next question. I'm going to toss over to you, Jesse. So, what are some examples or highlights or your thoughts on how tech companies, utilities, local governments, I would say state energy offices, obviously that I work in, PUCs, how can they collaborate effectively to support what I'll call smart data center development, where we're using our assets in a very smart way and efficient way, while we, also take advantage of the opportunities. So, and anybody else can weigh in after Jesse.
Yeah, I'd say that the myriad of approaches now is a little head spinning in some cases. I think we're seeing things that look like mobile gensets deployed to act as bridging power, right? You've got a site that's ready to go and the utility doesn't have all the equipment and the infrastructure set up. Deploying that for a short amount of time to ensure that you're not sort of creating a situation where there's stranded assets on site, but that you're not running lower efficiency gensets for the lifetime of the project, basically finding ways to kind of connect the two. I would also say some of the innovations around tariffs. I know there's a project in the Southwest around geothermal, allowing the off-taker to basically pay for grid connected power that's clean at a rate that's above the market rate, but still supports the project. Some of this kind of creativity there is important. I will say that the idea of installing, and this is maybe just me, but large scale CCGTs off grid without a roadmap that gets you connected to the grid worries me a bit, because the overbuild and inefficiency that you need to make that site reliable really doesn't actually serve the rest of the grid. I'm a big proponent of making sure we're all eventually grid connected, because there's massive benefits to basically the stability that comes from the grid and being able to share resources across the grid. And so that's one piece, is just sort of keeping in the back of mind, how do we make sure this is all eventually working together and not treated as a bunch of islands? I'm sure Brian and Sarah have
Any other panelists have some thoughts on this? Like Sarah's off mute.
Yeah, I think, the conversation around, innovative rate structures as sort of the intermediary between these facilities and the grid is a really good one. And some of my Berkeley Lab colleagues actually just put out a really great technical brief on what's happening kind of across the country in this space. And I'll put a link in the chat to that shortly. And I think part of what I'm really interested, a lot of my research is also on load flexibility and approaches related to, shifting the demands or using energy storage to better interact with the grid. And I think something that's really needed there is a better understanding, a more transparent understanding of what is the bottleneck on the grid side and what would actually help alleviate that. So if it's a generation issue, okay, what are the peak hours? How many hours of the year are we concerned about? And could we have a solution to address that? Or if it's more of a transmission issue, understanding those patterns when a certain line is being, at its capacity limits, or, maybe it's something more at the facility level where, you can flex your load all day and it's not necessarily going to help alleviate whatever infrastructure is needed to serve that site's peak load. So I think better understanding, where there's headroom on the grid, where there might be opportunities to deploy some of these innovative solutions specifically to alleviate those bottlenecks, as opposed to doing, dirty mobile gen sets, then I think, I hope there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I would just add that, like, from an economic perspective, it's really hard to match the reliability that we get from the grid by doing standby, right, or behind the meter. It's just it doesn't pencil, and so at the end of the day, we have a strong interest in making sure that the grid is reliable as it can be, and we also have a pretty strong interest in not developing that infrastructure out, on site. And so, that's actually been pretty central to our co-location position, as I noted in my comments, right? We want to see I think the better phrase is actually co-development, right? We want to co-develop generation alongside load. And if there are opportunities to bring that generation to the grid more quickly, right, to serve our growing load, as opposed to going through the existing interconnection queue process that we all know has extensive delays, right, then we should explore what those opportunities look like. But yeah, we see tremendous reliability benefit from the grid.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm going to kind of come back to you for a question. So, we obviously, a lot of people on this call work in the energy space. Energy landscape is evolving rapidly. It's hard to keep up with the technological innovations. We're seeing, tech boom level innovation happening, and everything from batteries to nuclear, stuff that we haven't seen move this fast in a bit. And one of the things we're doing here in Virginia a lot, and so the state energy office, we do modeling, forecasting, looking at this demand. Then you have JLARC doing that. And then you have the utilities doing their own forecasting. And then the PUCs doing their own forecasting across the country. Like, what are some of the more reliable forecasting assessment tools that you know of that can be used to help us see the future? What are some of the things you're using? And then others can weigh in on their thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, no crystal balls here. This is a really challenging space. And as I alluded to, I really feel for folks who have to be planning out on a 10-year or longer horizon, because of, how rapidly this is all changing. It is really challenging to have any certainty in what might happen that far out. So, I'll just reiterate some of my earlier points around the near-term forecasting, looking at where there are things, being built, under construction, where there might be, phased development of existing facilities, looking at orders that are being placed, firms that are trying to estimate the orders that are being placed. We don't know exactly what's going on in that space. You can get some of that near-term certainty, but of course, having to plan out on a longer horizon is difficult, and there are technical factors we can look at. What's like the wattage of new accelerators being developed, things like that. But again, there's so many factors at play. How much capital is going to be invested? What are the chips? If the chips get really cheap, we might have a lot more of them being bought. If they stay more expensive, maybe not. So I think it does come back to the idea of managing risk and managing the uncertainty, because I genuinely don't think there's a way around it. And so, we talked about managing risk in terms of like the contracting structures, having the companies, do certain commitments to purchasing energy. I know that's come up. So there's those like financial risk management mechanisms. And then I think, to some of the points Jesse was making, and Brian as well, there's a lot of load growth happening in the economy more broadly. And so I think thinking about the timelines of these different needs, yes, data centers are wanting a lot of power as quickly as possible. But as we think about, more EVs getting adopted, buildings electrifying, those loads, even heavy duty trucks and more electrification in large transport sectors. I think starting to think about where might there be sort of no regrets investments that can be made and building the grid out. And yes, maybe data centers sort of get that load in the meantime, but if something were to evolve with the data center needs, there are other demands coming online on a longer timeline. So I think there's some opportunities there to have less concern around building more now.
Jesse, I think, or Brian?
Yeah, I just to maybe follow up on that quickly, a couple thoughts. The first is around how can we sort of take this concept of shifting risk and putting more investment risk, financial requirements on the large loads coming to the system. How can we actually use that to inform the load forecast, right? And we actually think there's a way, particularly for like the near term forecast, the 3, 4, 5 years out, to say, look, if you're not subject to some sort of firm financial commitment, right, or collateral requirement, we're either going to discount you or not include you in the RTO's load forecast, right? That's a really positive, that's a good way to drive out some of the speculation. It's also a good way to nudge utilities and TOs to actually require some of these things like the collateral requirements or financial requirements over the term of a contract. Because today, right, there's a lot of variation in how the utilities and the TOs all look at load forecasting. I think someone alluded to it earlier, but just for example, in PJM, every single TO does load forecasting for large loads a little bit differently. And so it's hard to have a ton of confidence in those numbers if we don't have some form of either standardization or some mechanism to ensure that the large loads actually going into those forecasts are backed, by some sort of firm financial commitment. The other thing I would just throw out there is I see headlines all the time about sort of the 85 gigawatts, or you pick your number of gigawatts coming to a market near you. It's important to remember that in a lot of places, right, there is no cost to requesting interconnection to the system, right? And so I could be a 6 gigawatt facility, which, just by the way, 6 gigawatts is massive. So if you see 6 gigawatts, think about that for a second. But I could be a 6 gigawatt facility and go to my utility and say, hey, I want to interconnect to your system. The utility would have an obligation to study me the same as they would any other resource wanting to connect. And so until we can start to differentiate between those types of load, and our that's best done financially as opposed to some sort of interconnection process. But until we can start to do that, there's no way to parse through what is perhaps less real in a way that meaningfully informs, planning.
I strongly agree with both what Brian and Sarah said, but we'll just add to it that we feel pretty good at a top down at the US level, kind of a rough estimate of out to 2028 or 2030, load growth will be big, and it's sort of in a range. And you can get there in a lot of different ways, including looking at shipments and forecasts for capital spent by some of the big players. But if what you're saying is then I need to know in my territory how many data centers are coming, I'd actually go back and say that's so first off, that's not written yet, right? That there is no forecast that anyone can come up with because there's a lot to be determined. And part of what we're getting at on if I want to build gigawatts of data center capacity, if I had a clear map of where there was hosting capacity across the US, we would probably get there a lot quicker. But because it's very opaque, you have to go out and ask all the utilities. And depending on how the TOs and utilities aggregate those load forecasts, suddenly it looks like my 6 gigawatts is 60. And it's not, I truly believe we should assume positive intent. Everyone's trying to do something and build something. And the fact that the US is seeing more data centers than the rest of the world is partly because of low cost energy and locations, but also an environment that has made development possible. You don't want to shut that out. And so part of this is going to look at, when we get a total number, we probably think we're plus or minus a reasonable range out for the next 5 years. But in your own jurisdiction and your own state, I think Vince's question was the right one. Like, how do you attract it, and how do you attract it in a way that it's a positive economic benefit, not that you're sort of costing your residents money to support that. If you add that all together, it's helpful. I will just say that 2030 on energy planning timelines is it's not comical, but it is pretty short. And so if what you're really thinking about is what's your state energy plan out through 2040, there is a substantial amount of uncertainty, and I don't think we're going to get past that anytime soon.
And I'm gonna give y'all one more question, really for our modelers. And Brian's hit on some of this. You just hit on it. Like, there's a lot of concern, and during the legislature here, there was talk about cost shifting, and does this cost get placed on the customers, residential customers? Like, but there are also, as I noted, in Loudoun County and other places, there's economic benefits to data center development, economic growth. Is there a way to look at there will obviously be some cost shifting. You can't avoid it sometimes with the way different states are set up. Is there an opportunity to look at, like, does the economic benefit offset some of that? Is there a way to model that type of economic versus the cost shifting that could possibly occur? And I'll open that to anybody that wants to open. Or is there no answer? Or is that a question we just need to figure out?
I know, Sarah, your groups have done a lot of work on this. I will say, when we look at it, we're expecting potential costs to rise for electricity X data centers, just given we've been operating on a lot of depreciated assets, and we're going to have to revitalize the capital. And so I wouldn't compare the cost trajectories from 2020 to 2030. I would think about it relatively on a state basis and kind of a counterfactual, but that it is possible then, again, with the money coming in, to design tariffs where the cost shifting isn't actually landing on your constituents, where everyone wins. And think about the services that are valuable to the people coming, and it's not all about cost. Some of it's land and permitting and speed to power and other things. And so that tariff design really is going to dictate how you both attract these customers, but also benefit your overall rate paying citizens.
Yeah, I agree. I think the cost shifting concern is really a question of that the design of that relationship, that payment structure between the facilities and the utility. And I think there's a lot of theoretically, having more load and a larger rate base would lower the volumetric electricity costs for customers a lot. We're moving towards an increasingly fixed cost grid as we get away from, somewhat get away from fossil fuels and things like that. So the more you can spread those costs across more load, then that can be a downward force. And one of my colleagues, Andy Satchwell, has done work on EV integration and looking at, if you just add it to the grid, depending on how it gets added to the grid in terms of the load shape and the timing of those loads, it can either bring down the cost for everyone, or it can cause, more cost because of more peaking capacity needed. And so with data centers, yes, their baseline loads are going to be quite flat, but they are going to be investing in a lot of behind the meter energy resources, and potentially, those investments could be, upsized, or, additional investments could be made beyond the core reliability requirements to have them be integrated in the grid in a way that, regardless of any shifting of costs, just actually doesn't raise costs inherently to that one site. So, I think there's a lot to unpack on the energy cost side. And then I think the question of the local benefits is a good one, thinking about a lot of people say, oh, the jobs, it creates jobs, but only in the short term. That it might not be as short term as you would think, especially if it's a huge campus that's being built out over 4 or more stages. Then that construction stage where there are a lot of jobs, that might be going on for a decade. So there's, I think, more analysis on the job side and the job quality and job duration, I think that's not really my wheelhouse, but I think that's interesting to look closer at, as well as, tax revenue, things like that.
So now I'm going to take a few audience questions here that we have some in the chat. So I'll go ahead and start with those, and we're going to do rapid fire answering. But Brian, I think, wanted to weigh in one more thing.
Sorry, I did just want to weigh in on that last point that Sarah made, because it is a really good one. I was at a roundtable event a few months ago in Loudoun County, and we were actually at a data center that was under construction. And included in the roundtable were several labor voices. So the pipe fitters, the electricians, you name it. There were about 10 different groups recognized there. And there was a contractor, I believe he was a concrete contractor. About midway through the event, he kind of raised his hand and said, look, I want to be very clear. the data center industry has been providing concrete jobs for my company here in Loudoun County since 1997. And beyond that, the industry is supporting long-term six-figure jobs, six-figure blue-collar jobs, 45 minutes from the nation's capital. These are long-term jobs that provide real economic benefit to really critical and diverse sectors of our workforce. And so I just want to make sure we're offsetting any claims, right, that the industry somehow doesn't provide the jobs that others do, because that's simply not the case. The other point that I would make is that as we're thinking about the right ways to address cost allocation and whether or not different tariff structures may be required to ensure fair cost allocation, I would just say we need to be very careful to avoid discriminatory rate making in a way that could actually deter industry from developing in a certain region. And so, again, we think there are methods like those in Indiana, similar in West Virginia, that allocate that risk appropriately, but don't create a whole new rate class based on a specific type of user that can then just be a bucket to allocate any political costs that we may want to. So there is a balance. We need to be very careful of that balance moving forward.
Brian, I'll keep you on the mic. So one of the questions in the audience was, how fast do data centers innovate, i.e. exchange their chips? And is there a risk / opportunity that they move around the country much faster than traditional investments like traditional manufacturing?
It's a good question. I would say maybe first on the sort of moving around point, if you look at our investments when we announce them, they're generally between $1 and $5 billion in a certain region. Once we have committed that type of investment, it's very difficult to leave, right? Just from an economic perspective. And so usually once we commit to a region, right, we're not going to move elsewhere. The efficiency point, there's always going to be improvements in sort of how we're able, to compute information and the amount of power that draws. And so I don't expect that will change. I do think, again, back to this point about sort of allocating risk appropriately, if you put more risk on us for, provision of electric service, that forces us to think about the impact of those efficiency gains a little bit more. But yeah, absolutely, we're going to see continued investment.
And Jesse, so if folks are looking for those opportunities to materialize, what policies could or should states focus on now if they want to promote data center growth in their state?
I do have to say we specifically aren't policy advisors, and so I have to be a bit careful.
It was your question, but you can toss it to anybody that's willing.
No. I know. I would imagine, Sarah, you probably got some thoughts as well. Maybe defer, but maybe I'll pause there because I'll just start running off at the mouth.
We will not get Jesse in trouble. Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
We also do not, make policy recommendations, but I can speak a bit to where I see value in kind of state level opportunities and activities. So we mentioned in our planning discussion, talking a bit about how to leverage existing energy infrastructure. And Brian spoke to grid enhancing technologies, looking at, can you reconductor existing lines? Can you use new methods of managing line capacity and things like that to get more out of the existing grid? And so I think adopting those technologies to more quickly increase the capacity of the grid is a great kind of path to pursue. And then kind of Jesse mentioned this in the context of the shopping around issue and thinking about, could a given state area do more top-down assessments of where is their capacity and what does that capacity look like and the timelines of that, and make that known to the industry to have those opportunities be realized. And that could also kind of maybe mitigate some of the having to submit requests all over because they don't know where there might be those opportunities. And that way it's, less one-off studies, which I imagine are, quite the burden to utility staff and everything, and thinking about it, from a different way. I think that would be really interesting. And as part of that, looking at where's their capacity on the existing grid, but again, with the existing infrastructure, we've seen cases of reopening nuclear plants, 3 Mile Island and the Palisades in Michigan. There's opportunities to add hydro capacity at existing dams. So we've seen Iron Mountain do a PPA around that. DOE's also, through some of their program, Department of Energy's offered awards around installing battery storage at data centers. And then the other one I'll mention is a lot of interest in repurposing abandoned coal sites. So I know there's been investments in that for the last 10 years. Google's done some of that, purchasing old sites and leveraging, where are there sites that could be attractive, where there might be some interconnection equipment that's already available, and again, making that known to the industry so that those opportunities can be realized without, a lot of headache.
Yeah, as the former Brownfields program coordinator at the Department of Environmental Quality in Virginia, I like to hear about reuse of sites. And I hope Google and other folks who have, invested, a lot of tech companies invest in brownfield sites and reuse sites, and energy facilities seem like a no-brainer for looking at also doing that type of investment. So the tech companies have been really good at doing that. And I've seen billion-dollar investments go on brownfield sites like Amazon HQ2 in Virginia. And, we can do that with energy. So we don't have much time left. I'm going to turn it back over to NASEO and let them close us out. There's a few questions we didn't get to that maybe we can do a follow-up, or folks can answer in the Q&A if they would like to answer them.
Great. Thank you all so much. I do hate that we've run out of time, or we're running out of time, because what a fantastic lineup of speakers, and what an incredible discussion that has happened. I want to note that any questions that we didn't get to, we will try to make available. We'll try to provide some answers to you with our follow-up. We will send a follow-up with the recording, as well as the links that were put into the chat, so that you have access to those resources. Please also stay tuned for, if you're interested in any upcoming events that NASEO has, you can go to our website, naseo.org. And here we have a listing on this slide of upcoming events. I won't read them out now, but you can see them there, and they're on our website. Some of them are specifically for the state and territory energy offices only, but there are a lot that are like this one that are available to everyone. So please consider joining. Please also stay tuned to the next webinar in this discussion series. We'll be exploring, as I mentioned, the technological tools and innovations, and a lot of exciting opportunities there to address the challenges that we're facing with data centers, and also looking at policy approaches and policy innovations to address a lot of these new developments. So please just stay tuned for that, and we'll keep you informed. Thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks to all of you who joined this discussion. And again, thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy's State Energy Program for the support to make this series possible. So I believe, I have to say this has been, this team has kept on schedule. I've never, I think, been in a webinar where everybody was right down to the minute. So thank you all very much, a very disciplined group. Thank you very much, and looking forward to continuing the discussion with you all. Thank you.